Hey folks, this is Riker with a Path of Exile video on the best starter builds for the upcoming expansion, Lake of Kalandra. I coordinated with Path of Exile expert Arcthorin from the Max Roll team, and Max Roll just launched its Path of Exile branch to come up with a list of 5 excellent builds to start the new league with. These are builds that will not require you to get a bunch of lucky drops or do a ton of trading to get the right gear. These are builds that will scale well with the content, they'll get you easily through the campaign and well into the endgame content, but in the far endgame they will be superseded by the best builds. But you can use these to farm up all the gear and trade currency that you need to transition into one of the best endgame builds. And we'll provide you folks with links to guides on all these builds in the description below. Guides created by a variety of great Path of Exile content creators, many of whom are now on the Max Roll team. We'll also make a quick note here that we're generally not ascribing ownership of any of these builds to any single individual. There's a lot of different versions of different builds that get modified, re-emerge over the years. We're just forwarding you to people who have made guides on these builds. So without further ado, let's dive into our top 5. First, we'll start with a build that's familiar to our last League Starter video, the Explosive Arrow Ballista Elementalist. With this build, you lay down a bunch of ballista turrets. Those turrets shoot volleys of arrows at enemies, and then after a dramatic pause while the fuse burns down, those arrows explode. Oh, and the more arrows you have sticking out of an enemy, the bigger the damage and radius of the explosion. But that's not even the best part. The best part is the ignite proliferation mechanic, which means that even when an enemy dies, its corpse on the ground will still be on fire. And then other enemies walking over those burning corpses will also catch fire. So for this build, you start by picking the Witch class, which is the classic spellcaster. And this is so that you can live out every witch's fantasy of wielding a bow. Then you take the Elementalist Ascendancy, which turbocharges your elemental damage, the size of your explosions, and gives you a protective shield against incoming elemental damage. This build is very easy to gear, making it a painless league starter. Thanks to proliferation, it can easily clear all enemies on screen. The playstyle is also really safe because you just lay down your ballistas and then duck for cover. And while, yes, this build's single target damage did get nerfed with this patch, it now deals 15 to 20% less single target damage, the nerf doesn't matter. This build still deals a ton of single target damage. Now, as great as this build is, it's not without its downsides. First off, it's quite dependent on your life flask for health recovery. Also, there's some easy mistakes you can make with this build. However, Arcthorin has a full guide on this build, and he goes over the mistakes you want to avoid. So just follow his guide, link in the description, and you'll be good. On to build number 2, the Boneshatter Slayer. This build revolves around the Boneshatter skill, which is a melee attack that hits enemies so hard that some of that damage splashes back onto you. And if you stun an enemy with this attack, a damaging pulse will shoot out, damaging enemies in an area around you. To explain the mechanic a bit, when you hit an enemy with Boneshatter, you're going to gain a stack of trauma. Every stack of trauma you have gives you a small damage buff, but you also take physical damage for every trauma stack you have. Because of this, you want to focus on things that reduce the amount of physical damage that you take, like armor. Life recovery is also important to counteract the damage you're bringing upon yourself. Boneshatter's a fast, visceral, and exciting playstyle. You just run around with your raging Boneshatter, and as long as you can keep it up, you can go all night. You start off by picking the Duelist, which is a hybrid strength and dexterity class that's great at both dealing damage and avoiding damage. And then you take the Slayer Ascendancy class, which zeroes in on the offense side of things, while also giving you access to a lot of life leech. In fact, you gain the ability to life leech beyond your max life, which means your leeching continues even after you stop attacking enemies. The Boneshatter Slayer is a great build at running maps, and is arguably the best build for melee players this patch. As a downside, however, this build isn't great against bosses. You can tank through the boss fights, you won't die, but it's going to take a while to whittle down the bosses. You can find a full guide to this build by Tripolar Bear on Max Roll, link in the description. On to build number 3, Pox's Righteous Fire Inquisitor. Since we're on the topic of builds that hurt ourselves, we have this build that's based on Righteous Fire, which is a spell that engulfs you in fire that burns nearby enemies. And you, since you're on fire. That's just how fire works. The damage the fire deals scales with your life and energy shield. The more you have, the more damage you deal. And while you're under the effects of Righteous Fire, your spell damage is greatly increased. Now, because you're on fire and burning yourself constantly in order to survive with this build, you want to stack a ton of life regeneration, as well as maximum fire resistance. Now, Righteous Fire is great for dealing with groups of enemies, but it is weak against single targets, which is why you also want to work Fire Trap into the build. Fire Trap makes you throw a fire trap, which explodes and leaves a burning patch on the ground that will hurt enemies that walk through it. You start by taking the Templar class, which is a hybrid strength intelligence class, hybrid warrior spellcaster, kind of like Path of Exile's version of a cleric. Then you take the Inquisitor Ascendancy class, which focuses on enhancing elemental damage. Perfect for buffing our fire damage. This build is something of a fan favorite. People love it. It's amazing at running maps. You activate Righteous Fire once at the start of the map, then you just run around with shield charge and everything burns to death. It's also great at staying alive thanks to all the defenses and life regeneration you're stacking. Now, as for downsides, this is another build that's not great against single target. Until you get good gear, killing bosses will take a while. But again, you'll have the defenses to survive the fight. In general though, this build's itemization is a little more finicky than most starter builds. But as long as you grab the affixes that are recommended, you should be fine. The creator of the build, Pox, is arguably the world expert on Righteous Fire. He's mained Righteous Fire since basically forever. He's made multiple guides. He even runs an actual wiki on the skill that should answer any question about the skill's mechanics that you could possibly have. And we got a link to his guide in the description below. On to build number 4, the Poisonous Concoction Pathfinder, which returns from last League's League Starter video that we made, and is a League Starter that I ran with last League. What's really interesting about the Poisonous Concoction skill is that you can't have a weapon equipped, like at all. So that's one itemization slot you don't have to worry about. Instead of a weapon, you're throwing your flasks at enemies. It's just such a novel mechanic. So you throw your flask, it deals chaos damage in an area, and has a chance to poison enemies. If you have any charges left in your life flask, it will consume charges whenever you throw it to deal extra damage. The stronger your flask, the greater your extra damage. So you are extra motivated to keep your flasks upgraded with this build, beyond just their healing power. Furthermore, you can enhance this skill with the Greater Volley Support Gem, which lets you throw an insane number of flasks at once, which gives you a huge power spike early on in the leveling process. And your projectiles are able to shotgun single targets, meaning your flasks can overlap and hit a single target multiple times. Now, an important skill that you'll want that supplements this build is Plague Bearer. When you activate Plague Bearer, you deal less poison damage, but whenever you deal poison damage, you store part of the poison damage that you deal. Then when you activate this skill again, you release all the poison damage that you've accumulated. It hits enemies around you, and it's released over a period of time. So it's like a really long, extra deadly fart. This is particularly great for mapping, because you just activate the gas release, then shield charge around the map, running around farting out your poison and enemies drop dead. Every time you activate Plague Bearer, it alternates, it swaps between poison storing and poison releasing mode. To run this build, you start with the Agile Ranger class, and then move into the Pathfinder Ascendancy class, whose focus is on flasks. Now, this build is especially beginner friendly, because so much of its power comes straight from the Poisonous Concoction skill gem itself. The leveling experience and the early mapping experience is incredibly easy with this build. And gearing is also easy, since you don't need to rely on a weapon for damage, so you don't have to learn all the crafting rules to get yourself a good weapon. Again, just great for new players. Now, for all this build's strengths, it does have one considerable weakness. It just isn't great late game. While your mapping experience will be incredibly smooth, eventually, not having a weapon becomes a weakness, because other builds are eventually getting really powerful weapons to stack damage, whereas your ability to stack damage is limited. Also, this build isn't great for dealing with bosses, we're seeing a trend here, unless you've really invested heavily into the gear. You gotta be careful in boss fights to tough through them. And you can find a guide to this build on Max Roll written by Palsterin. Link in the description. And that takes us to our last build, build number 5, also returning from last League's video, the Spectral Helix Lightning Strike Champion. If you like hammered-ins, this build is for you, because Spectral Helix makes a spectral copy of your equipped weapon, hammer or otherwise, and swirls it around you. This skill has really high base damage, making it really strong for leveling. Even speedrunners use it. Now, while Spectral Helix is great early game, it doesn't scale well once you are gearing up to the very end game, well past the campaign, which is why you'll eventually want to swap to Lightning Strike as your main attack skill. Lightning Strike turns your melee strikes into lightning damage, and shoots out lightning projectiles to enemies who are further away from your melee target. You can even go for Vol Lightning Strike, which summons an orb that continuously shoots out projectiles even when you're not attacking. To run this build, you start by taking the Duelist class, then you take the Champion Ascendancy, which is a great mixture of offense and defense, and makes this build incredibly tanky thanks to the damage reduction granted by Fortify. This build makes leveling safe and easy thanks to the early game power of Spectral Helix. It's super tanky and it scales well into endgame by transitioning into Lightning Strike. That said, not everyone enjoys running with the Spectral Helix skill. The weapons that shoot out, they can collide with walls, at which point they despawn, and some people find that annoying when traversing tighter dungeons and maps. You also need to get decent gear before transitioning into Lightning Strike. You can find a build guide for this build on Max Roll written by Crouching Tuna. Link in the description. Now, while that's our top 5, we'll end this video by talking about some new interesting options you might want to consider. This expansion introduces 2 new lightning and shock-based skills, plus 1 shock-based support gem. Now, Path of Exile doesn't do any form of public beta before release, so these skills haven't been tested by the community, no reliable build guides have been made for them yet, but if you're feeling adventurous and want to try out the sexy new stuff and theorycraft and try to make your own build, these skills look really interesting, particularly after the buff they got after their initial reveal. So the first skill is Galvanic Field, which applies a buff to yourself that increases your chance to shock enemies. When you shock an enemy while you have this buff up, it creates a spherical field that attaches itself to the enemy and continuously zaps them and nearby enemies. The other skill, Lightning Conduit, strikes all shocked enemies in an area and removes the shock from them. So in both these cases, you need enemies to be shocked before you can really do anything. And that's where the new Overcharged Support Gem comes in. This gem gives supported skills a huge chance to shock, and also increases the effectiveness of your shocks, so you get a bigger payoff from your shock-related spells. But then you still need to find a way to shock your enemies to begin with. So something like the classic Orb of Storm skill can work here. It's a lightning spell that would be supported by the Overcharged Support Gem that creates an orb that will zap and shock enemies around it. Lightning Conduit and Orb of Storms can result in a nice 2-skill playstyle, where you alternate between shooting orbs to shock enemies, then delivering the punch with a Lightning Conduit, which will remove the shock, so then you gotta cast your Orb of Storms again, and repeat. But these are just some ideas to get you started. Remember, it's impossible to test these before the league launches. Do sound off in the comments with your theory crafting, or otherwise, with what starter build you're going for this league, because that's going to wrap up this video. But do go visit maxroll.gg as an excellent resource to getting started in this new expansion. Thanks for watching. Special thanks to my Twitch, Patreon, and YouTube supporters for making these videos possible. If you like what you see on this channel and want to support the creation of more content, you can consider pledging on YouTube or Patreon and unlocking behind-the-scenes content, monthly virtual hangouts, and more. If you enjoyed this video, please share it, check out these other videos, and subscribe to join Riker's Raiders for more ARPG content.